My name is Caroline Whitfield, I'm 68 years old, and I built a flooring and countertop business from a single pickup truck in Tulsa, Oklahoma into something that put 3 grandchildren through college. I tell you that not to impress you, but so you understand something before this story starts. I am not a woman who does things without a reason. So when I tell you that I stood outside my own daughter's wedding reception in a navy blue dress I'd bought special, holding a manila folder instead of a gift, you need to understand, I did not come there to ruin anything. I came there to end something that had been broken for a very long time. The woman working the guest check-in table looked at her tablet, looked at me, and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't see a Carol Whitfield on the list." "Check again," I said. "Under mother of the bride." She checked again. Her face did that thing young faces do when they realize they're about to say something that will hurt somebody, and they don't have the tools yet to soften it. There's no mother of the bride listed at all. Used, blank. Behind her, through the open doors of the Ambrose Estates ballroom, I could see the twinkle lights, the round tables draped in ivory linen, 200 people in their best clothes, and my daughter Renee in a wedding gown I had not been asked to help her choose, laughing with her head thrown back at something her new mother-in-law had said. He had raised that laugh. He had rocked her through croup at 3 in the morning in a 2-bedroom rental on Peoria Avenue. I had worked doubles hanging carpet so she could take dance lessons. And she had left me off her own guest list like I was a stranger who might wander in off the street. But to understand how we got here, I need to take you back before the wedding, back before the folder in my hands, back to the spring morning 18 months earlier when I first noticed the crack in the foundation of my daughter's love for me, a crack so fine I told myself I'd imagined it. If you're new to my channel, welcome. I'm Carol, and if you've ever loved someone who slowly stopped loving you back, not with a slam of the door, but with 1,000 small closings, then maybe you'll understand this story the way I lived it. Stay with me to the end, because I promise you, it does not end the way you think. I grew up poor in a way that people don't talk about much anymore, the kind of poor where you learn to check the mail before your mother gets home so she doesn't have to see the shut-off notice first. My father left when I was 9. My mother cleaned houses in the Maple Ridge neighborhood of Tulsa for families who called her by her first name and never learned her last one. I swore 2 things to myself before I was even out of high school: I would never depend on a man to keep a roof over my head, and if I ever had a child, that child would never know what it felt like to be poor and unseen at the same time. I met Renee's father, Douglas Foss, at 22, working the counter at a tile and flooring supply warehouse on the east side of town. It was charming in the specific way that men are charming when they've never had to work very hard for anything, good-looking, quick with a joke, always a little bit late. We married when I was 24. Renee was born when I was 26. By the time I was 29, Douglas had left for a woman named Patrice who worked in the leasing office of an apartment complex he was renting a unit in on the side, and I found out about her the same week I found out he'd taken $4,000 out of our joint savings account. He did not fall apart. I want to say that plainly, because so much of what comes later depends on you understanding that about me. He did not fall apart. He sat at my kitchen table with Renee asleep down the hall, and I made a list. Not the list of everything Douglas had done wrong, I didn't have time for that kind of list, but a list of everything I needed to do to make sure my daughter never felt the ground shift under her the way I had. He took a night class in business administration at Tulsa Community College while working days at the flooring warehouse. I learned the trade from the ground up: how to read a blueprint, how to estimate square footage, how to talk a supplier into net at 30 terms when you had nothing but your word as collateral. In 1994, when Renee was 7, I opened Whitfield Flooring and Design out of a rented storefront on 11th Street with 2 employees and a line of credit I'd had to beg for. By the time Renee graduated high school, Whitfield Flooring had 11 employees, 3 trucks, and contracts with 2 of the largest homebuilders in the Tulsa metro. He was not rich in the way people mean when they say rich on television. But I was solid. He owned my house outright by the time Renee was in college. He never had to ask anyone for anything, and more importantly, Renee never had to either. She went to the University of Oklahoma on money I had saved specifically for that purpose, a fund that started the week she was born, adding to it every single month no matter how thin things were some years. She studied marketing. She was smart, and funny, and she had her father's easy charm without, I believed, for most of her life, his carelessness. He was proud of her in the aching, complicated way that mothers who raise their children alone tend to be proud, a pride that has grief folded into it, grief for all the milestones a father wasn't there for, grief that gets absorbed and turned into something like extra love, because what else are you going to do with it? Renee met Todd Ashworth when she was 26, 3 years ago now, at a marketing conference in Dallas. Todd came from money, old Tulsa money, the kind with a family name on a wing of the Children's Hospital and a lake house at Grand Lake that had been in the family since the 60s. His mother, Diane Ashworth, was the kind of woman who ran the junior league the way other women run small countries, all velvet gloved authority and a smile that never quite reached her as when she looked at people she considered beneath her family's station. I noticed the crack that spring morning 18 months before the wedding, at a lunch Renee had asked me to have with her and Diane at a place called the Vintage Wine Bar downtown, all exposed brick and small plates that cost more than a full meal should. I remember exactly what Diane was wearing, a cream-colored blazer with a brooch shaped like a dragonfly, because I remember staring at that brooch while she said the thing that first made something go cold and still in my chest. Renee tells us you're in flooring, Diane said, in the tone of someone commenting on the weather in a place they don't plan to visit. That's such honest work. So hands-on. I own the company, I said, keeping my voice light. Whitfield Flooring and Design. We've done work for some of the biggest builders in the state. Of course, Diane said, and smiled, and turned back to Renee to ask about the caterer they were considering for the engagement party, and I understood in that moment that to Diane Ashworth, I was not a successful businesswoman who had built something out of nothing. I was Steph. I was the help who happened to be the mother of the girl her son was marrying, and the fact that I had paid for that girl's education, that girl's braces, that girl's every recital costume and college textbook, meant less to Diane than the cut of her blazer. What unsettled me more than Diane's condescension, though, was Renee's silence. My daughter, who used to correct people within seconds if they mispronounced her last name, sat there and let it pass. She didn't say, my mother built that company from nothing, with 2 employees and a truck. She didn't say anything at all. She reached for her wine glass and asked about flower arrangements. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself Renee was trying to keep the peace with her future mother-in-law, that any woman navigating a new family dynamic learns to pick her battles, that I was being oversensitive because I'd spent 30 years being the only adult in every room of my daughter's life and I wasn't used to sharing the stage. I drove home that afternoon and I did what I always did when something bothered me, I went into my office, at the house, and I worked. I have always believed that work is where the truth settles out, where you can think clearly, and that day I sat at my desk long after dark, going over invoices I didn't need to review, because I didn't want to sit with the quiet feeling that something in my daughter had shifted toward me, and I didn't yet have a name for what it was. Looking back now, I can see it was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself for the next year and a half, each time a little worse, each time a little easier for me to explain away. The way you talk yourself out of noticing smoke because you can't yet believe the house is on fire. The engagement party came 2 months later, held at the Ashworth family's lake house at Grand Lake, a sprawling stone and cedar place with its own boat dock and a wine cellar. Todd's father liked to give tours if I was invited. I want to be fair about that, because this isn't a story about being erased from day one. I was invited, and I was seated, at dinner, at the far end of the second table, next to Todd's great-aunt, a kind but nearly deaf woman named Bitsy who spent the evening asking me to repeat myself and then nodding as though she'd heard. At the head table sat Todd, Renat, Diane, Todd's father Richard, and, this is the detail I want you to hold on to, because it comes back later, Diane's brother, a soft-spoken attorney named Gerald Pruitt who specialized, as I would only learn much later, in estate law and family trusts. Halfway through dinner, Richard Ashworth stood up with a glass of champagne to make a toast. He talked about Todd as a boy, about the family's history at the lake house, about how proud he was to welcome Renee into a family that values legacy. He thanked, by name, Todd's grandparents, his business partners, his golf buddies who'd flown in from Houston. He did not once mention me. Not my name, not the fact that I existed, not even a generic nod to Renee's family. It was as though I had produced my daughter out of thin air and Richard Ashworth's toast was simply editing me out of a story that had never really included me. He sat next to deaf Bitsy at the far table and I smiled, because that is what you do, and I clapped when everyone clapped, and afterward Renee came over and hugged me and said, "Isn't this place amazing, Mom?" And I said yes, it was amazing, and I did not say, "Your future father-in-law just stood up in front of 200 people and erased me," because I did not yet have proof that this was a pattern and not an accident, and because some tired, hopeful part of me still believed that if I stayed calm, stayed gracious, stayed exactly the kind of mother who never made a fuss, my daughter would eventually see what was happening and say something herself. She did not say something herself. Not that night, and, as you'll see, not for a long time after. I want to tell you about my son-in-law, or my almost son-in-law at that point, because Todd is not the villain of this story in the way you might expect. Todd Ashworth was, a genuinely gentle man, soft-spoken, a little awkward in social situations that didn't involve golf or spreadsheets, and I believe, even now, that he loved my daughter without complication or agenda. Todd was raised, though, in a house where his mother's opinion was law, delivered so smoothly and with such apparent reasonableness that you often didn't notice you'd been steamrolled until you were already agreeing with something you didn't actually believe. Todd had spent 29 years learning that the path of least resistance with Diane Ashworth was simply not to contradict her, and he brought that same conflict avoidance into his relationship with my daughter without, I think, ever fully realizing what it would cost. The real architect of what happened to me over the following year and a half was not Todd. It was Diane, with her brother Gerald's quiet legal expertise working somewhere in the background like a current under still water, and it was, this is the hardest part for me to say, even now, my daughter's willingness to let it happen, because saying no to Diane Ashworth had become, for Renee, a habit she'd already half formed by the time I noticed anything was wrong. 3 months after the engagement party, Renee called me on a Tuesday evening while I was closing out the week's invoices, and she asked if she could come by the house that weekend to talk about some wedding stuff. I remember feeling relieved, actually, hearing that. Wedding stuff. Normal mother-daughter business. Fabric swatches and seating charts and the kind of task list I'd been waiting for her to hand me since the day Todd proposed. She came by on Saturday morning, and she brought coffee from the place on Cherry Street that used to be our ritual when she was in high school, the two of us splitting a cinnamon roll the size of a dinner plate before I opened the store. Some old habit in her must have remembered that, because she brought 2 coffees and a cinnamon roll, and for about 20 minutes we sat at my kitchen table and it felt, briefly, like nothing had changed at all. Then she pulled a folder out of her bag, not unlike the folder I would carry 18 months later, though of course neither of us could have known that irony was coming, and she slid it across the table to me, and she said, "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not make it a big deal." "Okay," I said, already feeling my stomach tighten, because in my experience, anyone who tells you not to make something a big deal is about to say something that absolutely is one. "Diane and Richard want to give Todd and me the house on Birchwood as a wedding gift," Renee said. "The one near their place at the lake, the little guest cottage they fixed up. It's basically ours already, they just need to finalize the transfer, and their lawyer, Uncle Gerald, said it would be cleaner, for tax reasons, if it's just in Todd's name for now, and mine gets added after the wedding once we're actually married. It's not a big deal, it's just paperwork." I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. What I felt was not suspicion about the house. What I felt was a small, sharp hurt that my daughter had come to my kitchen table, drunk my coffee, eaten half my cinnamon roll, and the entire purpose of her visit was not to reconnect with me but to prepare me, to soften me up, I realized later, for something that had nothing to do with me at all. She hadn't come because she missed our Saturday mornings. She'd come because Diane, or Gerald, or someone in that world had told her it would look better, would go over smoother, if she ran it by her mother first, made me feel included in a decision that had already been made without me in a room I'd never been invited into. "That sounds like a generous gift," I said, because it was true, and because I did not yet have the language for the thing that was actually bothering me. "Why would I make that a big deal?" Renee looked relieved, the particular relief of someone who expected a fight and got a pass instead. "I don't know," she said. I know you and Diane don't always click, and I didn't want you to think this is Todd's family trying to buy me or something." "Do you think that?" he asked. "No," she said, too quickly. "Of course not." He let it go. He let it go because I wanted to believe her, and because some cowardly, exhausted part of me had already decided that keeping the peace with my daughter mattered more than pulling at a thread I suspected, even then, might unravel something I wasn't ready to see. He hugged her at the door. He told her I was happy for her. He meant it, mostly, the way you can mean something and still feel a small stone lodge itself in your chest at the same time. It would be another 4 months before I learned that the Birchwood house, 140 acres, not a guest cottage, with a main house worth close to $2 million, had never actually been transferred to Todd and Renee jointly at all. It had been placed, quietly, into a family trust administered by Gerald Pruitt, with Diane and Richard Ashworth as the controlling trustees and Todd as a named but non-controlling beneficiary. Renee's name did not appear on a single document. Not as an owner. Not as a trustee. Not even as a beneficiary. She did not know this. I want to be very clear about that, because it matters enormously to everything that happens later in this story. My daughter did not know, for a long time, that she had been shut out of her own wedding gift the exact same way, though she couldn't yet see it, that she would one day shut me out of her wedding. But I am getting ahead of myself, and there is a great deal more you need to understand before we arrive at the ballroom, and the folder in my hands, and the guest list with my name missing from it, before any of this makes sense the way it needs to. Because the truth is, the story doesn't really begin with Renee at all. It begins with a phone call I received on a rainy Thursday afternoon in October, 11 months before the wedding, from a number I didn't recognize, a man's voice, careful and a little apologetic, saying my name like he wasn't quite sure he had the right person. Mrs. Whitfield? My name is Arthur Kessler. I'm an attorney here in Tulsa. I believe I have some information you're going to want to hear, and I think you're going to want to sit down first. I did sit down. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Renee had once slid a folder across to me about the Birchwood house, and I listened to Arthur Kessler tell me something that took the ground out from under me in a way I had not expected at 66 years old, after everything I thought I'd already survived. I represent the estate of Harold Whitfield, he said. Your late husband's uncle. He hadn't thought about Harold Whitfield in 15 years. Douglas's uncle, a quiet, odd man who'd made a fortune in oil and gas leases across 3 counties in the 80s and 90s and had never married, never had children, and had, as far as I knew, cut off contact with Douglas's side of the family sometime around when Douglas left me for Patrice, out of some old-fashioned sense that a man who abandons his wife and child doesn't deserve to be treated like family anymore. Edie met Harold twice, both times at holiday gatherings early in my marriage, and I remembered him mostly as a silent man in a corduroy jacket who watched everything and said almost nothing. Harold passed away in August, Kessler said. He had no children, and he outlived his siblings. His estate is substantial, mineral rights, some commercial property, investment accounts. In his will, he left the majority of it to charitable trusts. But he left one specific bequest to you, Ms. Whitfield. Not to Douglas. Not to Renee, not directly, not yet. To you. I remember gripping the phone so hard my knuckles ached. Why would he leave anything to me? He barely knew me. According to a letter he left with his estate documents, Kessler said, he watched what happened after Douglas left you. He said, and I'm reading this directly, I watched a nothing and nobody rebuild a life out of scraps while my nephew ran off and never looked back. I don't forget things like that. She raised that girl right, alone, and nobody ever gave her credit for it. This is that credit, 15 years late. He sat at my kitchen table and I cried, the first time I had cried in years, not out of grief, because I hadn't loved Harold Whitfield, hardly knew him at all, but out of something else entirely, the shock of being seen, after so long, by someone I never expected to be watching. The bequest was significant. I won't give you the exact figure, because it isn't the number that matters to this story, it's what the number represented and what it would come to mean over the following months. But I will tell you this, it was enough, combined with what I had already built through Whitfield flooring over 30 years, to change the shape of what I could do, what I could offer, what I could protect. It included, among other things, 3 commercial properties in downtown Tulsa, a substantial equities portfolio, and, this detail matters more than any other, the deed to a piece of undeveloped lakefront acreage at Grand Lake, adjacent to, though I did not realize this immediately, the Ashworth family's own property. He did not tell Renee. I want to sit with that decision for a moment, because I've asked myself many times since whether that was the right choice, and I still believe it was, even knowing everything that came after. I did not tell Renee because I did not want this inheritance to become a factor in how she saw me, or in how the Ashworths saw me, and because some instinct I couldn't name yet told me to hold this close, quietly, the way you hold a card in a game where you don't yet understand all the rules the other players are playing by. I did tell one person, my accountant and old friend of 20 years, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Priscilla Ochoa, who had done my books since Whitfield Flooring had 3 employees. Priscilla knew how to keep a confidence, and Priscilla, more importantly, knew people. She had a nephew who worked in county records, and it was Priscilla who first raised an eyebrow when we sat together going over the new property documents. Grand Lake, she said, tapping the parcel number on the survey. Carol, isn't that near where Renee's in-laws have their place? It's near a lot of places, I said. It's a big lake. Priscilla gave me a look over her reading glasses, the look she'd been giving me since 2003. You should have this surveyed properly. Get the exact boundary lines pulled. eBay got a bad feeling, and you know my bad feelings. I did know Priscilla's bad feelings, and I had learned over 2 decades never to dismiss them. So I had the lakefront parcel formally surveyed that November, a process that took 6 weeks and involved a survey team walking the property line with equipment while I stood at the edge of the woods in a coat too thin for the wind coming off the water, watching men in orange vests measure out boundaries I did not yet understand the significance of. What that survey revealed would not become important to me, or to Renee, for almost a full year. But I want you to hold on to it now, the way I held on to it then, quiet and unused, a card face down on the table. The undeveloped lakefront parcel Harold Whitfield left me shared a boundary line with the Ashworth family's own lake property. And more than that, the private access road the Ashworths had used for 30 years to reach the boat dock behind their house, the road that ran along the water's edge past what they'd always assumed was simply unclaimed county land, ran directly across a strip of the parcel that was now, legally, mine. I didn't do anything with that information in November. I filed it away, the way you file away a fact you don't yet know the use for, and I went back to my life, to Whitfield flooring, to wedding planning phone calls with Renee that felt increasingly like performances I was watching from behind glass, to Sunday dinners that Renee attended less and less often, always with a reason, always polite, always just slightly further away than the month before. It was around this time, December, 3 months before I would learn about the guest list, 10 months before the wedding, that I began to notice the second crack, deeper than the first. Renee called me to ask if I would help pay for a portion of the wedding. This, in itself, was not strange. I had always assumed I would contribute, had in fact set aside money for exactly this purpose the same way I'd set aside money for her college fund decades earlier. What struck me was the way she asked, and the amount. The Ashworths are covering the venue and catering, she said, since it's kind of become bigger than we originally planned, with all their family friends and business contacts. But there's the photography, and the flowers, and my dress, and, Mom, would you be able to do around 40,000? You know it's a lot, I just don't want you to feel left out of paying for stuff, since you always wanted to help with my wedding. I want you to notice the phrasing there, because I noticed it immediately and it stayed lodged in me for months, since you always wanted to help with my wedding. Not because your help matters. Not because we need it. Because you always wanted to. As though my desire to be a meaningful part of my only daughter's wedding was a sentimental indulgence they were kindly accommodating, a box to check so I wouldn't feel bad, rather than a natural expectation of a mother who had paid for every single major expense of her daughter's entire life up to that point. Of course, I said. I'd be glad to. He wrote the check. $40,000, for flowers and a photographer and a dress, while the actual event, the guest list, the seating, the toasts, the entire shape of the day, was being designed by Diane Ashworth's wedding planner, a severe, efficient woman named Corinne who communicated with me exactly twice over the following 10 months, both times to ask for payment, never once to ask my opinion on a single decision. He paid because I loved my daughter, and because some part of me, the part that had spent 30 years proving her wrong, proving Douglas wrong, proving every person who'd ever looked down on a single mother in the flooring business wrong, still believed that if I simply kept showing up, kept giving, kept being generous and gracious and endlessly patient, eventually my daughter would remember who had actually raised her, and the distance between us would close on its own. It did not close. If anything, over the following months, it widened, in small ways that were each individually forgivable and collectively devastating. He was not consulted on the guest list. He was not asked to help choose the wedding dress, a ritual I had imagined since she was a little girl playing dress-up in my old work shirts. He found out the wedding date had been moved up 2 months, from October to August, from a group text Diane sent to a family chat I was apparently added to as an afterthought, 3 days after everyone else. And then, in February, 6 months before the wedding, came the day I finally understood, with total clarity, exactly how far things had gone, the day Renee called me, her voice tight in a way I recognized from her childhood, right before she was about to ask me for something she already suspected I might refuse. "Mom," she said. "I need to ask you for something, and I need you to really think about it before you say no." "I'm listening," I said. "Todd's parents want to buy us a house as a wedding gift, a real one, in Tulsa, not just the lake cottage. But Uncle Gerald says for the trust structure to work the way they want, for tax purposes, they need Todd's side of the family to be the only names on any related paperwork. Which means, Mom, they're asking that you not be listed anywhere. Not as a witness, not as a co-signer if we ever needed one, nothing." And I told them that was insane, but then Diane said something that actually made sense, which is that since you're not married to anyone in the family, having your name on anything creates complications with the trust the lawyers are trying to avoid. He sat very still, the phone warm against my ear, and I asked the question I already knew the answer to. "And what do you think, Renee?" "Not what Diane thinks." "What do you think?" There was a long pause. "I think," she said finally, "that it's easier to just let them handle it their way. It's their money, Mom. It's their gift." "It's not just their gift," I said, and I heard my own voice shake in a way it almost never did, not in 30 years of hard conversations with suppliers and bankers and ex-husbands. "I've given you gifts your entire life, Renee. He gave you an education. He gave you a roof. I am currently giving you $40,000 for a wedding I wasn't allowed to help plan. Why is my name the one that has to disappear?" "Because you're not being difficult about it," Renee said, and I understood, in the specific silence that followed her words, that this sentence was not a compliment. It was an instruction. Because say you're not being difficult about it meant, continue not being difficult, Mother. Continue being the easy one, the convenient one, the one who writes checks and asks no questions and disappears from documents without complaint, because that is the role you have been assigned in this family now, and you have played it so well for so long that no one thinks to ask if you're willing to keep playing it. He did not fight her on it that day. I told her I needed to think, and I hung up the phone, and I drove, I remember this specifically, out to the Grand Lake parcel, the one Harold Whitfield had left me, the one Priscilla had told me to survey. I parked at the edge of the access road, the one the Ashworths had used for 30 years, and I stood there in the cold February wind coming off the water, and I looked at the little orange survey flag still fluttering along the property line, and something in me went very quiet and very clear. He was not going to fight my daughter for a seat at a table she no longer wanted to set for me. But I was, for the first time in this entire slow, humiliating unraveling, going to stop being surprised. I was going to start paying attention the way Priscilla had taught me to pay attention to a set of books that didn't quite add up. I was going to find out exactly what Diane and Richard Ashworth and their careful attorney brother Gerald Pruitt were actually building, quietly, underneath my daughter's wedding, because a family that goes to this much trouble to erase one woman's name from paperwork is a family working very hard to hide something, and I intended to find out exactly what it was, long before I ever needed to use it. I have never been the kind of woman who goes looking for a fight. What I am is a woman who, once she suspects the ground beneath her is not what it appears to be, cannot rest until she has walked every inch of it herself. So over the following 2 months, quietly, without telling Renee, without telling anyone but Priscilla, I began to look. The first thing I did was call Arthur Kessler, Harold Whitfield's estate attorney, and ask him a question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the day of the survey. Arthur, I said, if I wanted to understand exactly what documents exist regarding a family trust, the kind of family like the Ashworths might set up for a property gift, where would I even start looking, if I only had a name and a general idea? Arthur, bless him, was the kind of old-school Tulsa lawyer who believed information was a form of protection, not a weapon, and he walked me through the basics: county recorder's office for real property transfers, state filings for trust registrations were applicable, and, this was the piece that mattered most, the fact that any trust holding real property in Oklahoma has to have its deed transfers recorded publicly, no matter how private the family wanted to keep the arrangement itself. Deeds are public record, Carol, he told me. People forget that. They think because a lawyer drew up fancy paperwork behind closed doors, it stays behind closed doors. But the second real property changes hands, even into a trust, somebody has to record that deed at the courthouse. And once it's recorded, anybody can pull it. You don't need permission. You don't need a reason. You just need to know where to look. I want to tell you honestly that I did not go to the courthouse the next day planning to find a weapon. I went because I am a woman who cannot stand not knowing something, especially when it concerns my daughter, and because the request to erase my name from a house Renee would be living in had lit something in me that 30 years of quiet dignity had not entirely extinguished. I spent an afternoon in April at the Tulsa County Clerk's office with a young records clerk named Deshawn, who was patient with me in the way young people sometimes are with women my age who clearly don't spend much time in government buildings, walking me through the search system for recorded deeds and trust filings. What I found, over the course of that afternoon, was not one house. It was 3. The Birchwood property, the guest cottage I'd been told about at my kitchen table over cinnamon rolls a year earlier, had, as I already knew from Renee's own confused later admission, been placed entirely into the Ashworth Family Preservation Trust, with Diane and Richard as sole trustees, Todd as a non-controlling beneficiary, and no mention of Renee anywhere in the document. The Tulsa house, the wedding gift house Renee had called me about in February, the one they wanted my name kept off of entirely, had been purchased 6 weeks earlier, in March, for $1.4 million. It, though, had been placed into the same family trust. Not gifted to Todd and Renee as a married couple. Not even gifted to Todd alone, the way Renee believed. Held, entirely, by Diane and Richard, with Todd and Renee granted what the document called a revocable occupancy interest, meaning they could live there, at the pleasure of the trustees, for as long as the trustees allowed it, and not one day longer, and neither of their names appeared on the title at all. And the third document was the one that stopped my breath entirely, sitting there at that county clerk's terminal with Deshawn hovering politely nearby waiting for his next customer. It was a trust amendment, filed 8 months earlier, filed, I want you to notice the timing, almost exactly around the time Renee had first told me about wedding stuff over cinnamon rolls at my kitchen table, that added a clause regarding what the document called beneficiary contingencies in the event of marital dissolution. In plain English, it was a prenuptial adjacent trust provision, drafted not by Todd and Renee together as a couple protecting their shared interests, but unilaterally by Gerald Pruitt on behalf of Diane and Richard Ashworth, stating that in the event of a divorce, all trust-held property, the Birchwood cottage, the new Tulsa house, and, I noted with a cold, sick feeling, any and all real property acquired during the marriage by either beneficiary or their extended family that may be construed to benefit the marital estate, would revert entirely and exclusively to the Ashworth family line, with Renee entitled to nothing. That last clause, any and all real property acquired during the marriage by either beneficiary or their extended family, sat in my chest like a stone for 3 days before I understood what it actually meant, before I called Arthur Kessler again and asked him, carefully, hypothetically, whether a clause like that could be interpreted to reach toward property I might someday give my own daughter, property that had nothing to do with the Ashworths at all. It's broad language, deliberately so, Arthur said, after I read him the clause over the phone, my hand shaking slightly as I held the page. It sounds to me like whoever drafted this wanted maximum flexibility to claw back anything that touches the marriage, including gifts from the bride's side, if things ever went sideways. It's aggressive. Frankly, Carol, it's the kind of clause you write when you don't trust the marriage is going to last, or when you're preparing for the possibility that it won't, and you want every advantage locked in ahead of time, quietly, before anyone thinks to negotiate. He sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Diane Ashworth was not simply excluding me from paperwork out of old money snobbery, the way I had assumed for over a year. Diane Ashworth was constructing, brick by careful legal brick, a fortress designed to ensure that if, or perhaps when, her son's marriage to my daughter failed, Renee would walk away with nothing. Not the house she thought was half hers. Not the lake cottage. Not even, potentially, whatever her own mother might someday try to give her, if that gift could be construed as benefiting the marital estate. And my daughter, my smart, capable, marketing degree daughter, did not know a single word of any of this. She believed she was building a life with a man who loved her, in a family that had welcomed her, in houses that were becoming, slowly, hers. She had no idea she was a guest in her own future, standing on a floor that could be pulled out from under her at any moment, by people who had never once asked what she wanted, only what would protect their family name. This is the moment, if you're wondering, when I stopped being simply heard about the guest list arguments and the erased mentions and the $40,000 for flowers nobody asked my opinion on. This is the moment my heart turned into something with a purpose. Because I understood, sitting in my car in the county clerk's parking lot with printed copies of 3 deeds and a trust amendment in a folder on the passenger seat, that I was no longer simply a mother being slowly written out of her daughter's wedding. He was a woman who now knew something that could change everything, and I had absolutely no idea yet what I was going to do with that knowledge, only that I could not, in good conscience, do nothing. He called Priscilla that night and told her everything. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and then she said the thing that would guide almost everything I did for the next 4 months. Carol, you cannot go to Renee with this the way you found it. If you walk in there right now and say, your in-laws are trying to leave you with nothing if the marriage fails, she will not hear a warning. She will hear an attack on Todd, an attack on the wedding, an attack on the family she's trying so hard to belong to. She'll defend them before she even lets herself think about what you're actually saying. You need proof so complete, so undeniable, that she can't explain it away. And you need the right moment. Not before the wedding, when she's too invested to listen. You need to wait for the moment when she needs you to be right. I didn't like that advice. Every instinct in me wanted to drive straight to Renee's apartment that night and lay the documents on her kitchen table and beg her to see what I was seeing. But 30 years of building a business from nothing had taught me one thing above all else: timing is not cowardice. Timing is strategy. And so I did the hardest thing I have ever done as a mother. He waited. He kept writing checks for the wedding. I kept smiling through Diane's small cruelties. He kept my folder locked in the bottom drawer of my office desk at Whitfield Flooring, underneath old tax records nobody would ever think to look through, and I watched my daughter walk further and further into a house built on ground I now knew was hollow, telling myself every single day that I would know the moment when the moment came. He did not yet know that the moment would arrive on the day of her wedding itself, in the worst possible way, with my name missing from a guest list I had every right to be on. Wedding, I discovered, is its own kind of labor. It is easy to imagine that patience is passive, that a woman who decides to wait is simply standing still while life happens around her. That is not what those 4 months were like for me. Every phone call with Renee became a small excavation. Every family gathering became a chance to gather one more piece of the picture, one more sentence from Diane or Richard or, occasionally, a slip from Todd himself, who I was coming to understand was not a co-conspirator in his mother's plans but simply a man who had never been given the tools to stand up to her. In May, 4 months before the wedding, I hired a private investigator, a retired Tulsa police detective named Ray Solano who Priscilla had used years earlier during a messy business dispute with a former partner. He did not hire Ray to spy on my daughter. I want to be very clear about that boundary, because it mattered to me then and it matters to me now. I hired Ray to do something much more specific, to understand exactly how the Ashworth Family Preservation Trust was structured, who else had a stake in it, and, this was the piece I couldn't get from public deed records alone, whether there was any history to this pattern, whether Diane and Richard had done this before, to someone else, in some other marriage in their family's history. What Ray found took him 6 weeks and cost me more than I want to admit, and it was worth every dollar. Todd had an older sister, Whitney Ashworth Pierce, 12 years his senior, who I had met exactly twice, both times briefly, both times at family gatherings where she seemed to hover at the edges, polite but distant, the way you might behave around a family that no longer quite feels like yours. Whitney had been married once before, in her late 20s, to a man named Cal Pierce, a contractor from Bartlesville. That marriage had ended in divorce 6 years earlier, after 4 years together, and, Ray discovered this through public divorce filings, all a matter of record for anyone patient enough to dig. Cal Pierce had walked away from that marriage with almost nothing, despite having contributed significant labor and money to renovating a lake property that everyone, including Cal, had believed was jointly owned. It hadn't been jointly owned. It had been held, the entire time, in the very same Ashworth Family Preservation Trust, with a nearly identical beneficiary contingency clause that Gerald Pruitt, the same uncle, the same attorney, had drafted for Whitney's marriage 6 years before he drafted one for Renee's. Cal Pierce had spent 4 years and, according to his own divorce filing, close to $60,000 of his own money renovating a house he believed he had an ownership stake in, only to discover during the divorce proceedings that his name had never been on a single document, and the trust reverted everything back to Diane and Richard the moment the marriage ended. I sat in my kitchen with Ray's report spread across the table and I felt something shift inside me, a kind of grief I hadn't expected, grief not just for my own daughter's situation, but for Whitney, a woman I barely knew, who had apparently watched her own family do this to her once already and had never said a word to warn the next woman who married into it. I wondered, and I still wonder, whether Whitney's distance at family gatherings wasn't coldness at all, but something closer to shame, or grief, or a kind of learned silence about a family that protected its money more fiercely than it protected its own children's happiness. This was the piece I needed. This was the pattern that turned my collection of documents from a suspicious legal structure into undeniable, damning proof of intent. Diane and Richard Ashworth were not simply cautious, old money people protecting a family legacy in the abstract, the way Todd's father had put it at the engagement party toast that never once mentioned my name. They were repeat architects of a specific, calculated cruelty, draw a spouse deep into a life built on property and stability that felt permanent, let that spouse invest years and money and identity into a home they believed was theirs, and then, the moment the marriage showed any sign of strain, pull every asset back behind the family's walls and leave that spouse, leave that person who had trusted them, with nothing at all to show for years of their life. He called Priscilla that night, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, my voice broke on the phone. "They did this to Whitney," I said. "And nobody warned Renee. Not Whitney, not Todd, nobody. She has no idea she's walking into the exact same trap." "Then you have your moment coming," Priscilla said quietly. "You just have to wait for it to arrive, and you have to be ready when it does." I want to tell you about one more thing that happened during those waiting months, because it matters to everything that follows, and because it's the part of this story where I finally understood what my own inheritance from Harold Whitfield was actually for. In June, 2 months before the wedding, I received a call from a land development firm that had apparently been trying for over a year to acquire full, unified access rights to a stretch of Grand Lake shoreline for a private marina and boat club project, a project that, they explained, had been stalled indefinitely because of a single unresolved property line dispute involving several adjacent landowners, including, though the caller didn't initially realize the significance of what he was telling me, a certain access road that ran across a parcel now legally mine, the parcel Harold Whitfield had left me, the parcel Priscilla had told me to survey a year earlier. "Mrs. Whitfield," the developer's representative said, a polished young man named Trent, "we understand you hold clear title to a parcel that includes the sole legal access easement currently used by several lakefront property owners, including the Ashworth family, to reach their private dock. We'd like to discuss either purchasing the parcel outright, or negotiating a formal easement agreement, because as it currently stands, our understanding is that the Ashworth family's use of that access road has never actually been formally granted. It's what our attorneys call a permissive use, that was never legally documented, meaning technically, at any time, the title holder could revoke that access entirely." He sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment, looking out my kitchen window at nothing in particular, and I felt the last piece of something enormous click quietly into place. For 30 years, the Ashworth family had used a private road to reach the boat dock behind the very lake house where they had once excluded me from a toast, where Richard Ashworth had thanked golf buddies and business partners and never once said my name. They had used that road assuming it was simply theirs, the way people who have never had to fight for anything assume the ground beneath their feet will always hold. And through a twist of fate so precise it felt almost like justice arriving late but arriving nonetheless, that road now sat on land that belonged, entirely and legally, to me. He did not do anything with that information yet. I told Trent I needed time to consider his offer, and I hung up the phone, and I sat at my kitchen table with the folder of Ashworth Trust documents on one side and the survey of my Grand Lake parcel on the other, and I understood, finally, completely, what I was going to do, and when I was going to do it, and why it had to be exactly the way Priscilla had said all along. I needed to wait for the moment Renee needed me to be right. He did not know yet that the moment would come wrapped in the cruelest possible package, the day of her wedding, at a check-in table, with a stranger telling me my own name did not appear anywhere on the list of people invited to watch my daughter get married. The final 6 weeks before the wedding were the strangest of my life, because I lived them on 2 separate tracks at once. On one track, I was mother of the bride Carol, attending the last cake tasting I was invited to, which was really more of a formality since Corinne the wedding planner had already made the actual selection weeks earlier, getting fitted for the navy blue dress I would eventually wear to stand outside a ballroom holding a folder instead of a gift, fielding Renee's increasingly rare, increasingly rushed phone calls, always about logistics, never about feelings, never about us. On the other track, I was a woman quietly assembling a case, meeting with Arthur Kessler twice more to make sure every document I had was not just accurate but properly authenticated, meeting with Ray Solano one final time to confirm every detail of the Whitney Pierce divorce filing, and meeting, finally, with Trent from the land development firm to sign a formal, notarized document, not a sale, I want to be clear. I never sold that parcel to anyone, but a private, binding right up first. Refusal agreement that gave me full legal control over exactly if, when, and how the Grand Lake Access Road easement would ever be formalized, an agreement I structured specifically so that no one, not the developer, not the Ashworths, not anyone, could act on that road without my direct, written consent. It was during this period, 3 weeks before the wedding, that the cruelest single moment of the entire ordeal happened, the one that still, even now, telling you this story years later, makes something tighten in my chest. Renee called me on a Sunday evening, and for the first few minutes, it felt almost like the old days. She was laughing about a bridesmaid dress disaster, asking my opinion on shoes. And something in me that had been braced for a year finally let its shoulders drop, just slightly, hopeful that whatever had been pulling us apart was loosening its grip. And then she said, in the same breezy tone she'd used to ask about the shoes, "Oh, and Mom, quick thing, Diane wants the ceremony program to just list the wedding party and the officiant, no parent names at all. Since Todd's parents are hosting and it gets complicated listing everybody's different last names and situations. So don't be weird if you don't see your name on the program, okay? It's not personal. It's not personal." I have turned that phrase over in my mind more times than I can count in the months since. It's not personal, said about the removal of my name from a program celebrating the marriage of the child I raised alone, from birth, through croup and braces and college and every single milestone in between, while Douglas, a man who had contributed exactly $4,000 in stolen savings and then vanished for 25 years, would, I would later confirm, still be acknowledged in the ceremony's spoken introduction, because Renee's father, however absent, still carried a name and a bloodline the Ashworths considered worth mentioning, while her mother, who had built an actual life for her out of nothing, apparently did not. Okay, I said, because what else was there to say, at that point, that hadn't already been said and already been dismissed? Whatever's easiest. He did not cry after that call. I had, by that point, cried through most of the available grief already, over the previous 18 months, in small private installments, in my car, in my office, in the quiet hours after Renee's calls ended. What I felt instead, sitting alone at my kitchen table that Sunday night with the folder of Ashworth documents still locked in my desk drawer at the office, was something colder and clearer than grief. He felt, for the first time, completely and finally ready. 2 weeks before the wedding, I received the final piece of information I needed, and it came, of all places, from Todd himself, in a moment I don't believe he ever intended to be significant. I ran into him, genuinely by accident, at a hardware store on Yale Avenue, where I'd gone to pick up supplies for a rental property I was renovating, and where he was buying paint for what he called the new place, meaning the Tulsa house his parents had bought that he still, at that point, believed was jointly his and Renee's. We talked for a few minutes, pleasant, a little awkward the way we always were, and then Todd said something that I don't think he understood the weight of at all. I keep telling Renee we should just get our own place eventually, something small, just ours, no trust stuff, no family complications, he said, running a hand through his hair in that boyish, uncertain way he had. She deserves something that's actually hers, you know? Something nobody can ever take back. Does she know it's not hers now? He asked, as gently as I could manage. The Tulsa house. Does she know your name's the only one that has any real claim, and even that's complicated? Todd went very still, and something crossed his face that I will remember for the rest of my life, a kind of dawning, uncomfortable understanding, as though a question he had never quite let himself ask out loud had just been asked for him by someone else, standing in the paint aisle of a hardware store on a Tuesday afternoon. What do you mean, complicated? He said. I did not tell him everything that day. It wasn't the moment yet, and Priscilla's voice was still in my head, telling me to wait for the moment Renee needed me to be right, not the moment that was merely convenient. But I told him enough, that he might want to ask his Uncle Gerald for a full, plain English explanation of exactly how the trust was structured, and exactly what would happen to the Tulsa house, and to Renee, if the marriage ever ended for any reason at all. Todd called me that night. His voice, when I answered, was tight in a way I had never heard from him before. I asked my dad, he said. About the trust. It got weird and said I should talk to Gerald. He talked to Gerald. Carol, did you know? Is that why you asked me that today? I know a great deal, Todd, I said carefully. And I think it's time somebody in your family started being honest with Renee, because right now, she believes she's building a life with you. She doesn't know she's a guest in someone else's house who could be asked to leave with nothing, the same way your sister was. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then Todd said, very quietly, Whitney never talks about her divorce. Nobody's allowed to bring it up. I know why now, I said. And I think you should ask her yourself, before your wedding, not after. I do not know exactly what Todd said to Whitney over the following days, or what Whitney finally told him, 12 years of silence breaking open at last between a brother and sister who had never really been given permission to talk honestly about what their parents had done. What I know is that 10 days before the wedding, Todd showed up at my office at Whitfield Flooring, unannounced, his face pale and his hands unsteady, and said, I need to see whatever you have. I love it. Please. I looked at this young man, this genuinely gentle person who had spent his whole life avoiding conflict with a mother who had never once in 29 years given him a reason to believe conflict with her was survivable, and I made a decision that Priscilla, when I told her about it later, said was either the bravest or the most reckless thing I'd done in this entire saga, depending on how it played out. I opened my desk drawer, and I took out the folder, and I laid every document on the table in front of him, the trust filings, the Tulsa house title, the beneficiary contingency clause, and finally, the divorce filing of Cal Pierce, his own brother-in-law, the man his sister Whitney had married and lost everything alongside, 6 years before anyone thought to warn Renee she might be walking into the exact same fate. Todd read through every page in complete silence, and when he finished, he looked up at me with an expression I will never forget, not anger, not even shock anymore, but something closer to grief. The specific grief of a person realizing that the family who raised him had built their love, at least in part, on a foundation of careful, repeated betrayal, and that he had almost let it happen to the woman he loved without ever knowing enough to stop it. What do I do? He asked me. That, I said, is entirely up to you. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do, Todd, and I want you to hear it clearly, because it isn't a threat against you or against Renee. It's a promise to protect her, the same way I've protected her since the day she was born, whether or not your family ever intended to let me. Todd left my office that day and I did not hear from him for 4 days, 4 days that felt longer than the entire 18 months that preceded them, because I did not know which way he would break, toward his mother, the way he had broken so many times before, or toward the truth, and toward Renee. He went through the motions of those 4 days on autopilot, approving final invoices at Whitfield Flooring, signing off on the last wedding vendor payments, sitting through a rehearsal dinner planning call with Corinne where I was informed, without apology, that I would be seated at table 4, not the family table, at the rehearsal dinner itself. On the 5th day, my phone rang, and it was not Todd. It was Renee, and the moment I heard her voice, cracked and thin in a way I had not heard since she was a teenager, I knew that whatever Todd had decided to do, he had done it. Mom, she said. I need you to tell me everything. Right now. Todd showed me some papers and I don't understand what I'm looking at, and he won't stop crying, and I need you to explain it to me like I'm 5 years old, because I think something terrible is happening and nobody told me. I want to tell you that in that moment I felt vindicated, or relieved, or even hopeful. What I actually felt was a kind of exhausted grief, because my daughter, 28 years old, 3 weeks from her wedding, was calling her mother in a panic to have basic facts about her own life explained to her. Facts that a family who claimed to love her had kept from her for over a year while cheerfully accepting checks from me for flowers and photography. I drove to her apartment that night, the apartment she still kept, technically, though she'd been staying at the new Tulsa house most weeks, and I sat with her at her kitchen table, a smaller, plainer table than mine, and I laid out everything, slowly, carefully, the way you'd explain a diagnosis to someone you loved. The trust. The beneficiary contingency clause. Whitney and Cal Pierce and the $60,000 of renovation money that vanished along with 4 years of a marriage the moment it ended. The fact that her own name did not appear on a single document related to either house she believed, in some fashion, belonged to her and Todd. Rena did not cry the way I expected her to. She went very still, the way I had gone still standing at the edge of that lake parcel back in February, and then she asked a question that told me, more than anything else in this entire ordeal, that my daughter, despite everything, despite 18 months of small betrayals I'd absorbed silently, was still, underneath it all, the sharp, capable young woman I had raised. Why didn't you tell me sooner, ma'am? You've been known about this for months. You let me keep planning this wedding, keep paying that woman for flowers, you let me stand there and ask you to take your own name off documents, and you knew the whole time what they were actually doing. It was, I will admit, a fair question, and one I had asked myself more than once during those long waiting months. Because, I said, if I had come to you 6 months ago and said Diane Ashworth is trying to trap you the same way she trapped Todd's sister, you would not have believed me. You would have heard a mother who never liked Diane, attacking a family you were trying to become part of, and you would have defended them, the way you defended the guest list, the way you defended the trust paperwork, the way you defended every single thing they did to shrink me out of your life for a year and a half, Rena, because that's what you'd been trained to do by then, defend them, and let me absorb it. She flinched at that, visibly, and I regretted the sharpness of it even as I said it, because grief does that, it makes you say true things in cruel shapes, when a softer shape might have landed better. But I did not take it back, because it was true, and because I had spent 18 months being gentle and it had gotten me erased from a guest list 3 days before that very conversation, though neither of us knew that yet. I needed proof so complete you couldn't argue your way around it, I said, more gently. And I needed you to hear it from a place where you weren't defending your own decision to keep planning the wedding. I needed Todd to be the one who found it, honestly, because you'd believe him faster than you'd believe me. I'm sorry it took this long. I am not sorry I waited for the right moment instead of the convenient one. Renee sat with that for a long time, staring at the documents spread across her small kitchen table, and then she said the thing that broke something open in me that I hadn't realized was still closed. I've been so awful to you, she said. Haven't I, this whole time? I let them push you out of everything and I just went along with it, because it was easier, and because some part of me thought you'd always just be there no matter what I did, because you always have been. I did not tell her it was all right. I have learned, over 68 years, that telling someone their cruelty was all right, even out of love, even out of the desperate wish to comfort them, teaches them that cruelty toward you costs nothing. So instead I said, it hurt very badly, Rena. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. But I love you, and I built my entire life around making sure you'd never have to fight for a place at any table the way I did. I'm not going to stop now, even after everything, even after the guest list." Her head came up sharply. "What guest list?" I realized, in that moment, that Renee genuinely did not know, that somewhere in the chaos of Corinne's planning, in the layers of Diane's control over every detail, my name had been removed from the official guest check-in list without Renee's knowledge or approval, the same quiet, bureaucratic erasure that had been happening to me in 100 small ways for 18 months. Except this time it had happened without my daughter's consent, which told me something important. Some of what had been done to me over the past year and a half had, in fact, been done entirely by Diane, entirely behind Renee's back, using Renee's wedding as the instrument. "I don't know yet," I said carefully. "But I intend to find out exactly what's on that list before your wedding day, Renee. And depending on what I find, I think it might be time for me to finally use something I've been holding onto for almost a year, something I never told you about, because I didn't know yet if I'd ever need it." "What is it?" Renee asked, and for the first time in 18 months, I saw in her eyes the specific, focused attention of a daughter who genuinely wanted to understand her mother, not manage her, not smooth her over, not apologize on someone else's behalf. Actually understand. So I told her about Harold Whitfield, and the inheritance, and the survey Priscilla had insisted on, and the access road that ran across land that was legally, entirely, undeniably mine. Land that the Ashworth family had used for 30 years without ever once bothering to formalize the right, because people who have never had anything taken from them rarely think to protect the things they assume will always simply be there. Renee listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life, something that told me, more than any apology could have, that my daughter and I were finally standing on the same side of whatever came next. "Mom," she said, "I think you should go to that wedding with everything you've got. I think it's time somebody in that family found out what it feels like to have the ground pulled out from under them." The 2 weeks between that conversation at Renee's kitchen table and the wedding itself were the most carefully orchestrated 2 weeks of my professional life, and I include in that 30 years of running Whitfield Flooring, negotiating supplier contracts, and once talking a bank manager into a line of credit with nothing but a business plan and sheer will. Destime, though, I was not building a company. I was building a moment, and I intended for it to land exactly once, exactly right, with no room for Diane Ashworth to talk her way around it the way she had talked her way around every objection anyone in that family had ever raised to her for 30 years. The first thing Renee and I did, together, quietly, was confirm exactly how and why my name had disappeared from the official guest check-in list. It took one phone call from Renee to Corinne, the wedding planner, delivered in a tone I had never once heard my daughter use before, flat, controlled, utterly without apology, to get the truth. Corinne, flustered, explained that 2 weeks earlier, Diane had personally called her and instructed her to simplify the mother of the bride's situation on the official list, explaining that there had been some complications on that side of the family and that it would be cleaner, going forward, to list only the 2 mothers who were actively involved, meaning Diane herself, and Todd's late maternal grandmother, whose name Diane wanted included as a tribute, a woman who had been dead for 9 years and had never once met Renee. I was, in other words, erased from my daughter's guest list not through some innocent administrative mix-up, not through the general vagueness of family complications, but through a direct, deliberate instruction from Diane Ashworth, given without Renee's knowledge, given specifically to ensure that on the single day when every eye in that ballroom would be looking for the people who mattered most to the bride, I would not officially exist. Renee cried when Corinne told her this, the first tears I'd seen from her through this entire ordeal, and then she did something that told me, finally and completely, that my daughter had come all the way back to me. She looked at me across her kitchen table and said, "I want you to do whatever you were planning to do, ma'am. Whatever it is. I don't want to know the details in advance, because I don't want my face to give anything away at the reception. But I want you there, and I want them to understand exactly who they tried to erase." We settled on a plan, quiet and precise. I would not confront anyone before the ceremony. Renee's wedding day would not become a legal battlefield during her vows, and I would not do that to her, regardless of what her in-laws had done to me. I would attend the ceremony itself from wherever I was seated, even if that seat, as it turned out, would be at a folding chair added at the very back after Renee insisted, over Diane's objections, that her mother be allowed inside the venue at all. And then, at the reception, during the traditional window after dinner when toasts were given and guests mingled freely, I would approach Diane and Richard Ashworth directly, with the documents in hand, and I would give them one chance, privately, to correct what they had done, not just to me, but to Renee, and years earlier, to Whitney and Cal Pierce, before I made any of it public in the room. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters to understanding who I am and why I built the plan the way I did. This was never, at any point, about humiliating my daughter's wedding day. Priscilla asked me directly, the week before, sitting in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold between her hands, "Carol, are you doing this for justice, or are you doing this to make them feel as small as they made you feel?" And I sat with that question for longer than I'm proud of before I answered her honestly. "Both," I said. "I want it to be about justice. But I would be lying if I said some part of me doesn't want Diane Ashworth to feel, just once, what it's like to have the ground she's standing on turn out not to be as solid as she assumed." Priscilla nodded slowly. "Then make sure the justice part wins," she said. "Because the other part will feel good for about 10 minutes, and the justice part is the only piece that actually protects Renee for the rest of her marriage." I took that advice seriously, and it shaped exactly how I structured what I did next. Rather than simply arriving at the wedding to expose the Ashworths publicly, humiliating them in front of 200 guests in a way that might have felt satisfying but would have left Renee to clean up the social wreckage of her own wedding for years, I worked with Arthur Kessler in the final week to draft something far more surgical, a formal, notarized letter, delivered privately, that laid out 3 things in plain, undeniable legal language. First, it detailed the exact terms of the Ashworth Family Preservation Trust as it currently stood, including the beneficiary contingency clause that would leave Renee with nothing in the event of a divorce, information I now knew, thanks to Todd's own admission, that Renee's fiancé fully understood and was prepared to insist be renegotiated before the marriage, not after, with his own attorney present, separate from his uncle Gerald. Second, it detailed, blandly, the parallel history of Whitney Ashworth Pierce's divorce from Cal Pierce, including the $60,000 in personal funds Cal had invested in a home he never had any legal claim to, establishing, in writing, that this was not a hypothetical risk but a documented, repeated pattern. And third, this was the piece that I believe, more than any other, is what finally moved Diane and Richard Ashworth to do what they did at the wedding, more than shame, more than love for their son, more even than fear of scandal. It detailed my legal, notarized right of first refusal control over the Grand Lake access easement, the private road the Ashworth family had used without formal legal right for 30 years to reach their own boat dock, a road that ran, for its entire length along the water's edge, across land that Harold Whitfield, in a final act of quiet justice 15 years in the making, had left entirely and irrevocably to me. He had Arthur draft the letter to make one thing unmistakably clear: I was not threatening to cut off their lake access out of spite. He was informing them, calmly and factually, that as the current legal title holder of that easement, I retained full discretion over whether to formalize it, sell it, or revoke it, and that my decision on that matter would be directly and permanently influenced by whether the Ashworth family chose, that day, to finally treat both my daughter and me the way we had always deserved to be treated, with the plain, unglamorous dignity that 30 years of honest work should have earned me a very long. Dime algo. He sealed that letter in a plain manila folder 2 days before the wedding, and I set it on the small table by my front door where I keep my keys and my purse, and every time I walked past it over those final 2 days, I felt something in my chest that was not quite fear and not quite anticipation, but some steady, settled cousin of both, the feeling, I think, of a woman who has spent 18 months being patient finally arriving at the edge of the moment she has been patient for. The morning of the wedding, I put on the navy blue dress I had bought for an occasion I once imagined would be entirely different from the one it turned out to be, and I picked up that folder from the table by the door, and I drove to the Ambrose estate not knowing, even then, exactly how the day would end, only knowing, with complete and total certainty, that I was done being erased. Which brings us back, finally, to where I started telling you this story, to the check-in table outside the Ambrose estate ballroom, to the young woman with the tablet telling me there was no Carol Whitfield on the guest list, to the folder in my hands, to the sound of my daughter's laughter drifting out through the open doors from a reception I had, according to Diane Ashworth's careful instructions, no official right to attend. I understand there's some confusion, I told the young woman at the table, keeping my voice level, the same voice I'd used for 30 years talking down anxious clients and unreasonable suppliers. I'd like you to please let Renee Whitfield, the bride, know that her mother is here, and that I need 2 minutes with Diane Ashworth before I come inside. Can you do that for me? To her credit, the young woman didn't argue. She disappeared into the ballroom, and a few minutes later, it was not Renee who came out first, but Diane, sweeping through the doors in a champagne-colored gown, her dragonfly brooch replaced tonight with a diamond pendant, her expression arranging itself into the same smooth, faintly amused condescension I remembered from the wine bar 18 months earlier. "Carol," she said, as though greeting an unexpected delivery. "I believe there was a mix-up with the seating charts. I'm sure we can find you a spot at the back somewhere, but honestly, the timing is a bit. I'm not here about a seat, Diane," I said. "I'm here about this." I opened the folder and held out the notarized letter, and I watched, with a kind of calm I did not know I was capable of feeling in that moment, as Diane Ashworth's face moved through several expressions in quick succession, irritation, confusion, and then, as her eyes moved down the page and landed on the phrase Ashworth Family Preservation Trust, something that I can only describe as the particular stillness of a person realizing, all at once, that a door she believed was locked has just swung open from the other side. "Where did you get this?" she said, and her voice had lost every trace of its earlier amusement. "From the county clerk's office," I said. "Public record, Diane. Anyone can pull a recorded deed. You should know that, given how carefully your brother structures these trusts to keep everything else so private." "This is a private family matter," Diane said, her voice dropping, glancing back over her shoulder toward the ballroom doors. "This is not the time or the place." "You're right," I said. "It isn't. Which is exactly why I came to you first, privately, instead of walking into that ballroom and reading this letter out loud to 200 guests, the way I imagine some mothers in my position might have been tempted to do, after being erased from their own daughter's guest list on your instruction." That landed. I watched it land, watched something flicker behind Diane's carefully composed features, because whatever else Diane Ashworth was, she was not stupid, and she understood immediately that I had just told her, blandly, that I possessed both the information and the restraint to end her family's reputation in that town in a single evening, and had chosen, so far, not to. "What do you want?" she said finally, and I noted, with something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it, that for the first time in 18 months, Diane Ashworth was asking me a question instead of informing me of a decision. "I want 3 things," I said. First, that trust amendment gets renegotiated, properly, with Renee and her own attorney present, not Gerald, someone independent, before this marriage is a single day old. She gets equal standing on both properties, real standing, not an occupancy interest that can be revoked whenever it's convenient for your family. Second, I want you to think very carefully about your niece Whitney and what your family did to her and Cal Pierce, because I have his divorce filing, Diane, and I have Ray Solano's full report on the pattern, and I would very much like for Renee to be the last woman in this family who ever has to learn this lesson the hard way. Diane's face had gone pale beneath her makeup. "And the third thing?" "The third thing," I said, "is that you're going to walk back into that ballroom right now, and you're going to find whoever is about to give the toasts, and you are going to personally correct the guest list and the ceremony program error, out loud, in front of everyone, acknowledging me as Renee's mother, the same courtesy you extended to Todd's late grandmother, a woman who never met my daughter a single day in her life. And then you and I are going to enjoy the rest of this evening like 2 civilized women who both love the same young couple, and tomorrow, your brother is going to call my attorney, Arthur Kessler, to begin renegotiating the trust in good faith." "And if I refuse," Diane said, though her voice had lost most of its earlier steel. "Then I go home tonight," I said, "and tomorrow morning, I have a conversation with the land developer who has been trying for over a year to formalize the access easement your family has been using without any legal right for 30 years, the road to your own boat dock, Diane, which happens to run entirely across land that belonged, as of 11 months ago, to me. And I let him and his lawyers handle it however they see fit, which I understand could mean anything from a very expensive negotiated easement fee to a permanently closed gate, depending on how motivated they are to finish their marina project." I watched something in Diane Ashworth break, quietly, behind her eyes, not dramatically, not with tears, because women like Diane are not built for public collapse, but with the specific, deflating stillness of someone who has just understood, completely, that she has lost a fight she didn't know she was in until it was already over. "You've been planning this," she said, "for a very long time." "I've been surviving this," I corrected her, "for a very long time. Planning it only took the last few months." It was at that moment that Renee appeared in the ballroom doorway, her wedding gown catching the light from inside, her face searching mine with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a little girl, checking to see whether I was truly all right after a hard day, and I understood, watching my daughter's eyes move between me and her mother-in-law, that whatever happened in the next 5 minutes would set the tone for the rest of her marriage. "Mom," Renee said. "Is everything okay?" "It's about to be," I said, and I looked at Diane Ashworth, and I waited. Diane straightened her spine, smoothed the front of her champagne gown with 2 careful hands, and turned to face her new daughter-in-law with a smile so perfectly composed that I almost admired the sheer discipline of it, even knowing everything I now knew about the woman wearing it. "Renee, sweetheart," Diane said, her voice pitched to Carrie, already walking back through the ballroom doors, already performing the correction I had demanded before I had even finished demanding it. "There's been a terrible oversight on the program, and I want to fix it properly, right now, in front of everyone, because your mother deserves so much better than what happened tonight." I followed them both inside, into the light and the noise and the 200 faces that turned, one by one, toward the small commotion at the front of the room, and I stood beside my daughter as Diane Ashworth took the microphone from a startled DJ and said, into a room gone quiet with curiosity, the words I had waited 18 months, and one entire lifetime before that, to hear someone in that family say about me out loud. "I'd like to properly welcome Carol Whitfield," Diane said, her voice only slightly unsteady, "Renee's mother, a woman who built an entire business from nothing and raised the extraordinary young woman marrying my son, entirely on her own. There was an error on tonight's program, and I want to correct it now, with the respect she has always deserved. The applause that followed was polite, and certain, the sound of 200 people who understood that something significant had just happened without knowing exactly what, and I stood there in my navy blue dress, holding an empty folder because I'd left the actual documents in my car, and I felt something in my chest finally, after 18 months, come fully unclenched. I would like to tell you the rest of that evening was pure joy, and in many ways it was. I danced with my daughter during the mother-daughter portion of the reception that Corinne had originally scheduled to happen quietly, off to the side, and that Renee now insisted be moved to the center of the floor, under the full lights, while she held my hands and said, quietly, just for me, I'm sorry it took me so long to see what they were doing. I'm not going to let it happen again. But I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the entire reason any of you have stayed with me this long. Healing a year and a half of small betrayals does not happen in a single evening, no matter how satisfying the confrontation. It happens slowly, afterward, in 100 small repairs that have to be made deliberately, the way you rebuild trust in anything that's been cracked, carefully, and with patience, and without pretending the crack was never there. Hiral Pruitt called Arthur Kessler the following Tuesday, exactly as promised, and over the following 2 months, the Ashworth Family Preservation Trust was formally amended. Renee's name was added as a full co-beneficiary on both the Birchwood Cottage and the Tulsa house, with equal standing to Todd's, and the beneficiary contingency clause was rewritten entirely, this time by an independent attorney Renee hired herself, using, I'll admit with some quiet pride, money from her own savings rather than a check from me, because she told me she needed this particular fight to be one she funded herself. Whitney Ashworth Pierce called me 3 weeks after the wedding, out of the blue, her voice hesitant on the phone in a way that told me she had been building up the courage to make that call for a long time. I heard what you did, she said. I heard what you found out about Cal and me. I never told anyone, because I was so ashamed, and because my parents made it very clear that talking about it would be seen as disloyal. Thank you for not letting it happen to Renee too. He told Whitney what I believed with my whole heart, that she had nothing to be ashamed of, that the shame belonged entirely to a family that built its love around conditions and contingencies instead of trust. And that if she ever wanted to pursue anything regarding what had happened in her own divorce, 6 years on, I would gladly connect her with Arthur Kessler, who I suspected would have quite a lot to say about statutes of limitations on fraud claims involving concealed trust structures. Whitney did, eventually, pursue exactly that, and while that is a story for another day, I will tell you that she did not walk away from it with nothing a second time. As for the Grand Lake Access Road, I want you to know I never closed that gate. I formalized the easement, properly, permanently, with a fair market agreement that Trent's development firm helped broker, ensuring the Ashworth family retained legal access to their own dock for as long as they owned the property, in exchange for a settlement that, frankly, more than covered every dollar of the $40,000 I'd spent on flowers and photography Diane's planner never once asked my opinion about. He did not do this to be generous, exactly, though I suppose in the end it was generous. He did it because Priscilla was right, all those months ago, sitting in my kitchen with her coffee going cold, I wanted the justice part to win. Punishing an entire family for the sins of its matriarch would have cost my daughter more than it would have cost Diane Ashworth, and I had spent 30 years building a life around the principle that you do not tear down the house your child is standing in, even when you have every right to. Diane and I did not become friends. You want to be honest about that too, because I think there's a temptation in stories like this to wrap everything into a tidy bow, and I don't believe in lying to you after everything else I've told you truthfully. Diane Ashworth remains, to this day, a woman who values her family's name more naturally than she values the people who carry it, and I don't believe that fundamental fact about her changed in a single evening at a wedding reception, no matter how thoroughly I outmaneuvered her that night. What changed is that Diane learned, finally and permanently, that I was not a woman who could be quietly erased, and that lesson, once learned, tends to stay learned. She is polite to me now, at holidays, at the grandchildren's birthdays that came 2 years later, polite in the careful, measured way you're polite to someone you've come to respect precisely because they once proved they were more dangerous, in the best sense of that word, than you gave them credit for. Todos, for his part, became something I did not expect, an ally, and eventually, a genuine friend. He told me once, a year or so after the wedding, over a cup of coffee at that same place on Cherry Street where Renee used to buy me cinnamon rolls, that finding those documents in my office that day was the first time in his entire life he'd ever actually stood up to his mother about anything, and that once he'd done it once, it got easier every time after. You didn't just protect Renee, he told me. You kind of gave me my spine back, though, whether you meant to or not. Renee and I talk every week now, real conversations, not logistics, not performances for other people's benefit. She still lives in that Tulsa house, the one that is now, finally, legally and fully hers as much as it is Todd's, and she calls me sometimes just to tell me about her day, the way she used to when she was small, before the world got complicated, before a family with old money and careful lawyers tried, briefly, to convince her that her own mother's love was somehow less legitimate because it came without a trust attached to it. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this: love that requires you to disappear is not love, no matter how gently the disappearing is requested, no matter how many times you're told it isn't personal. He spent 30 years building a life so that my daughter would never have to feel small, and I very nearly let another family convince me it was my turn to feel small instead, quietly, gracefully, without complaint, simply because complaining seemed impolite. It was not impolite. It was necessary. And I want you to remember that the next time someone in your own life tries to erase you a little at a time, so slowly you almost don't notice, until one day you're standing outside a door with your own name missing from the list of people who are supposed to matter. You matter. Say so, when you have to. Show up with whatever deed, whatever proof, whatever quiet strength you've spent your whole life building, and do not apologize for bringing it with you. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to fight to be seen by the very people who should have seen you all along, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below, and if you want more stories like this one, please consider subscribing, because there are many more women like me who found their voice a little later than they wished they had, but found it all the same.